Um, Good morning, everyone. It's my honor to introduce our speaker for this seminar, Professor Viktor Vanberg. He studied sociology at the University of Münster and Berlin. As a researcher, he met Nobel Prize-winning economist James Buchanan and was invited to do research with him in the United States. He was teaching economics at the university in America, and when he returned after 12 years, he got the prestigious chair of economic policy at the University of Freiburg. He also became the director of the Walter Eucken Institute, and in this seminar he will introduce us to the ideas of an economic and monetary constitution, which was influential on the jurisprudence of the Bundesverfassungsgericht, and we are happy to learn more about this topic from him.
So thank you very much. Thank you also for the invitation and the opportunity to talk to you about a subject that is close to my heart, as you will realize. I hope you can hear me even at the end of the table. Now, I chose a little bit a different title, not economic and monetary constitution, but I will talk about both. I chose the more general title, the constitutional approach in economics. And just as an early warning, constitutional is meant in the general sense of the rules framing a system of social interaction. Whether it's an economy, a polity, you could speak of the political constitution, of the economic constitution, or with regard to a corporation, the corporate constitution. So constitution is just in the general sense, framework of rules. I have organized my talk into these 6 sections. After a brief introduction, I will talk about the Freiburg School of Order Liberalism, the Virginia School of Constitutional Economics or Constitutional Political Economy, then about the concept of Ordnungspolitik, a Freiburg concept, translated, you can say, rule-based politics, and the 5th section about the reason of rules, and then a conclusion. Now, to introduce this subject, it's motivating to think about, and you may have noticed some of it, in the recent Eurozone crisis. There has been a controversy in Europe on the German rule-based approach to this, legal rule-based approach to the crisis, for how to go about, how to handle this crisis. And in large parts of Europe, and in many groups, including, as I will quote now, The Economist, the famous weekly journal, they were puzzled about this German approach and resented it. And typical is this title of an article in The Economist, of Rules and Order. Germany's order liberalism has had a big influence on policy during the Euro crisis. And in this article, The Economist asked, why are Germans obsessed with rules for their own sake? Now, this reference to order liberalism, a research and teaching tradition in Germany that is called the Freiburg School. I call it the Freiburg School of Law and Economics. It was founded in the 1930s by economists and lawyers teaching at the University of Freiburg. At the time, there existed still, and it existed until the late 1960s, the Fakultät für Rechts- und Staatswissenschaften. In this faculty of law and, I call it social sciences, economists and lawyers were teaching in the same faculty, and they were in much closer contact than is the fact today, where these departments are separated. And it was in particular the economist Walter Eucken. By the way, he was the son of the philosopher Rudolf Eucken, who received the Nobel Prize in Literature, because there is no Nobel Prize in economics. So if you want to award the Nobel Prize to a philosopher, you have to do this under a separate, different title, and he received the Nobel Prize in literature. So his son was, the name was quite popular in Germany, which also explained that Walter Eucken was more protected against prosecution by the National Socialists than other members of this school, because they probably were concerned about the public attention it would draw if they would go after Walter Eucken. And the second, the most prominent or most influential lawyer participating in this, in creating this research and teaching tradition was Franz Böhm. By the way, Franz Böhm did his habilitation in Freiburg. Then he got an appointment at the University of Jena, but was dismissed from this position in 1936 because of critical remarks about the National Socialist prosecution of the Jews. He got only an appointment again then after the war, and he very soon went into politics. He was a member of the Bundestag and was the person who was in charge of negotiating with the State of Israel the Wiedergutmachung for the atrocities that the National Socialists had committed. Now, the research tradition that the Freiburg scholars created has become known. This label was given this tradition later, has become known under the name Ordo Liberalism. And the name was supposed to signal that they considered themselves in the tradition of classical liberalism, but were critical of what they labeled, and is often so labeled, laissez-faire liberalism. A liberalism that programmatically emphasizes that, say, a hands-off policy. So the role of government should be minimized, and then the market was supposed to operate beneficially. And their argument was the market order, the market is not a natural product. It does not originate just by if one lets things go. Said the market is a system of economic interaction that is framed by legal rules and institutions and informal rules. And how the market operates, whether it operates beneficially or not, depends on the rules of the game. The core principle of markets is, of course, competition. And I often, when I taught classes, to illustrate the point, I told my students, so please compete, and those who win will get the best grades in this class. Then they looked at me, what does it mean to compete? You can compete in all kinds of manners. One way would be by fist fight, and the person who stands upright as the last one is then the winner. So to make the point is competition has to be under rules, and so the Freiburg emphasis was competition should be put under rules that make for what they call Leistungswettbewerb. Basically, the rules should be such that producers can have success only by better service to consumers. This was basically taking up Adam Smith's statement that it's obvious that we produce in order to consume. So consumption is the purpose of production. And he even said this should be so obvious that it would be a waste of time to try to justify it. But the conclusion that Smith drew was then the rules of the economic game should be such that this game is played to the benefit of the consumers. And in order to do so, producers should be under competition. They should compete for the favor of the consumers. So with order liberalism, they wanted to emphasize there has to be an order, which means a legal framework, and the legal institutional framework will affect how the market operates. Then they were critical of the existing interventionist, they call it or you can call it the economic state, a state that is authorized to intervene in a discretionary manner in all ways, all kinds of ways in the economic process. And their argument was a government that is authorized to intervene in discretionary manner in the economic process will necessarily become the target of demands of various interest groups. And in a democratic system, in order to gain the political support of such interest groups, they are tempted to grant them discretionary treatment, and they call it privileges, by discretionary intervention to favor particular interest groups at the expense of other members of the citizenry. So their emphasis was the state in a market economy has to play a very important role. The state should abstain from intervening into the economic process, but the state's important responsibility is to create, to provide and enforce a framework of rules that makes the economy operate. They call it to have a humane and functionable economy. You could also translate it into saying to make the economy work in a way that is beneficial to the citizenry, to the constituents of the polity. Their research program can basically be divided into two parts. The one, Ordnungstheorie. Ordnungstheorie is basically the inquiry into how do different rules affect the resulting economic order. The economist who has taught for many years at the University of Freiburg, Friedrich August von Hayek, he makes this distinction between the order of rules and the order of actions. He basically argues all kinds of social interactions take de facto place under some rules. And the rules, how they are, affects the kind of order of actions. So the order of rules affects the order of actions. And Ordnungstheorie is the systematic inquiry into, say, what will change at the level of the resulting order of actions if we change systematically something at the level of the rules. Then there is the applied side. Some people, they speak about normative economics, and I don't like this description because it's not, normative sounds as if this would be about preaching. I rather call it applied economics. It's about how, if you want to, the resulting order of actions to have certain properties, what do you need to do at the level of rules? So it's Ordnungspolitik, is so the recipes for politics, what to do in order to affect the resulting order of actions in desired ways. And the emphasis of Ordnungspolitik, as I will talk about a little bit later, is on restricting government basically to such rule-based. The government efforts should not be directed at creating desirable outcomes by direct interventions into the process, but in an indirect manner to create desirable outcomes by adopting and enforcing appropriate rules that tend to create such outcomes. Now, the Freiburg tradition was for a long time, say, a unique German approach in economics. Quite independently of this Freiburg tradition, James Buchanan, a US economist who was already mentioned, he received the Nobel Prize in 1986. I had joined the center that he directed in 1983, so indirectly I benefited from the award being given to him. Independently of the Freiburg school, he developed a research program that in spirit is quite similar to the Freiburg tradition. except for the fact that he explicitly develops it in a more generalized way. The Freiburg school attention was very much focused on what they called the economic constitution, the Wirtschaftsverfassung, and their emphasis was on the task of government, basically in opposition to the, or as a corrective to the traditional perception of liberalism, the responsibility of government to provide an appropriate economic constitution. Buchanan generalizes this idea of ruled frameworks affecting the resulting order of interactions within these rules, applying it also in particular to the political constitution. So the economic constitution, the research program is about how markets, the economy works dependent on the framework of rules within which it operates, and correspondingly the political constitution is about how politics works dependent on the rules within which it operates. And the emphasis here, corresponding to the Freiburg notion of Ordnungspolitik, is that to improve the workings of the market, one should not seek to directly improve it by specific interventions, but to improve markets would mean to improve the rules, so improve the overall working properties of markets, and the same with regard to politics. The theoretical perspective, at the core of the theoretical perspective is the systematic distinction between two levels of choice: the choice of rules and the choice within rules. And as for those of you who may have been there, as I mentioned yesterday evening, in constitutional economics, one likes to use the game metaphor to illustrate what the theoretical perspective is about. In playing games, the participants, once they decided what to play, say play poker, the next step is to agree on what rules do we want to adopt for our playing the game. And once the game is decided and the rules are decided, then there's the level of playing the game. And what is one of the interesting questions to analyze is that in playing the game, the participants may very well get into conflicts of interest, because everybody tries within the given rules to play the game successfully. And of course, there are also other problems. Everybody may be tempted, if there's an opportunity, to cheat on the rules, to get a benefit. And so if you have a system that is governed by rules, you need an enforcement mechanism, enforcing. In sports, we have the referees who supervise. And there's also the temptation for players, say, to influence the referee to be biased. And so there are all kinds of additional problems. But basically, the essence is, in playing the game, the players may be in conflict there may be conflicts of interest among players, which does not include that as a choice. They may well come to agreement on how to change the rules in order to play a better game, better in the judgments of everybody involved. So there are these two different interests. The one is in playing the game, the interest in playing the game successfully, and in deciding on the rules, the joint interest in adopting rules that make for a better game. Now the fourth and section on the concept of Ordnungspolitik, or rule-based politics, that I mentioned before. The common emphasis of both of the Freiburg School and the Virginia, I think I called it Virginia School. The reason is Buchanan, except for a very short period when he taught at the University of California, has always taught at Virginia universities, University of Virginia in Charlottesville, the Virginia Political Institute and State University in Blacksburg, and then at the end at George Mason University in Fairfax, close to Washington, D.C. And therefore, the program that he initiated is often referred to as the Virginia School of Constitutional Economics. Now, both the Freiburg tradition and the Constitutional Economics program emphasize that economic policy should focus on shaping the rule framework in a way that makes for a conducive playing of the economic game. They should abstain, governments should abstain from intervention. And the motivation in both cases is very similar. The Freiburg scholars, they emphasized discretionary politics necessarily results in granting privileges to particular interests, and this will create a perverse process of interest group lobbying governments to seek privilege. Government will grant privileges, and this will in an accumulating way distort the market process, the economic process. The research program that Buchanan helped to initiate, they talk about rent seeking, that interest groups seek rents. Rent is a technical term in economics that you get. Rent is an income that you earn beyond what you could earn in alternative uses. And basically, interest groups, they, to put it simply, as a lobbying for, say, steel producers. Steel producers could consider to invest the next 100 euro in improving their productive capacity, or to invest it in lobbying government to get protection, for instance, from foreign steel imports, or to get subsidies. And in a rent, what the Virginia people call rent-seeking society, if it's so that the 100 euros invested in rent-seeking generate more income in the sense of better prices that you can realize because of restricted imports or because of the subsidies you get, then this increment that the $100 generate more through lobbying is a rent. So rent seeking is the equivalent to privilege seeking, so getting a privileged treatment. And both emphasize the essence of a market order. And the Virginia school would emphasize, because they have a more developed political theory, the essence of a democratic system is that everybody should play under the same rules. There should be no privileges. The state should abstain from. Granting privileges is a violation of the basic principle of a market economy, and is a violation of the basic principle of a democratic system where all are supposed to be equals and equally free. So their emphasis is the state's primary task is to make for a better economic system and social system in terms of the outcomes that result by improving the rules and monitoring the rules and correcting defects in the rule framework rather than through discretionary intervention. Now, one concept that has often caused unnecessary irritation and controversy is that the Freiburg school advocates, they talked about the strong state. That they said, what they required or what they pleaded for, namely Ordnungspolitik, requires a strong state. And critics have often imputed that this meant that the Freiburg school was calling for an authoritarian state with large power. And this is a total misunderstanding, because a strong state was for them a label for a state that is able to resist the pressure of interest groups and thereby resists the temptation to grant privileges to particular groups and instead is empowered to serve the common interest, the common good, you would say, the interest that all citizens share. And the way they thought that such a strong state can be created was exactly the opposite, not by granting such a state extreme powers, but by restricting its authority to prevent it and to take away the authority to grant privileges, to grant special treatment to particular interest groups. What the Freiburg School advocates did not do is that they started a systematic inquiry. Now, what would be the specific constitutional provisions that make for what they call a strong state? Because, as I said before, their focus was very much on the issue of the economic constitution. The question of the political constitution is an issue that has been taken up much more systematically within the Virginia School tradition of constitutional economics. Okay, now I get back to what I started with, this controversy around the German order-liberal approach to the Euro crisis. Of course, one could ask, as I do here, why should government, or why should the citizens of democratic polities, why should they wish their government to be bound by rules, to be limited to a rule-based policy instead of being allowed to do in every choice situation what the government expects, all things considered, to bring about the best outcome? On the face of it, you would say, no, you would want your government to be flexible, to respond in every situation, to bring about the best outcomes. Why constrain governments by requiring governments or limiting governments to only rule changes as an instrument of affecting what will result as overall outcome? Now, I will discuss in the following 3 reasons why the reasons of rules or reasons for rules, which I label the knowledge problem, the incentive problem, and the reputation problem. Okay, now first to the knowledge problem. Hayek, whose writings on this subject I find very instructive, so basically my own research program consists of an integration of the Freiburg tradition, Hayek's research program, and the constitutional political economy research program. Hayek, in many of his writings, have pointed out we can look at rules as tools, just as ordinary tools like a hammer are instruments to solve recurrent problems. A hammer, we have to put nails into walls for whatever reason, so a hammer is a useful instrument to solve this recurrent problem. And so Hayek argues, in personal life, we encounter repeatedly certain types of problems. In social interaction, we encounter repeatedly the same types of problems. Every single situation is, of course, unique, in common. And so as we consider ordinary tools as instruments for solving recurrent problems, we can think of rules. Rules of, say, for instance, the problem individual conduct when to get up in the morning. You can make it in a discretionary manner every morning, just how you feel, but people can learn that you will probably be more successful in whatever you do if you impose a rule on yourself to get up at a certain time and start your day and or say when to drink alcohol. So of course you can do it in the morning too, but this may make you so adopting a rule only after a certain time of the day, and so on. And the same in social interaction. Now, what is the benefit of rules as opposed to case-by-case discretionary decision? One important aspect is that about rules, one can learn over time. Rules can be improved, so experience can accumulate for how, just like tools. I often used as a simple example, say, humankind at some point after our predecessors originally got their food just by running around and finding berries and whatever. At one point in time, somebody got the idea you can grow food. Now, in order to grow food, you have to get the seeds into the ground. So probably originally they did it with their fingers, which is unpleasant. And so somebody got the idea to pick up something, say a stick, to others observed this, imitated it. By imitating it, they created new variety, different kinds of sticks, different wood. These are more useful for this. So you can imagine a continuous process in which, by learning, trial and error elimination, in the end, we have our highly sophisticated plows that farmers are using today. And Hayek's argument, in the same sense, there is an evolutionary process in social life where people learn to adopt rules, and they, by observing and imitating others who apparently practice rules that make them more successful. So with rules you can learn over time from case-by-case decisions, responding always to the uniqueness of an individual situation. You cannot accumulate. Now, next question that one may ask, now all rules are necessarily selective. They tell us to focus on particular aspects of the situation. Take the rule in traffic, to stop at red, go at green. Now, this means that you could again compare it. If I decide, considering all things, if I stop at red, and I could just as well get across without getting into a collision, without getting a ticket because there is no policeman, and so on. So I could just as well, this is waste of time. And just going on green, irrespective of that, there may be an idiot just coming across and I get into a... So why not consider every case in itself and do what is best? So I approach an intersection, then I see it's red, but I see is the street wet? Is there a policeman? Is there a speed control system? So if nothing of this kind, I go across and I save time. Now, the point that Hayek makes, we live in a complex world, and in face of what he calls the inexhaustible complexity of everything, it's in fact impossible for us to consider everything. We may wish to consider everything, but in our attempt to consider everything, we will necessarily be selective. We will not observe everything. So what we have to compare is the selectivity of the rule versus the selectivity of our discretionary choice. And with imperfect human beings, there is a lot to say for the selectivity of, say, time-tested rules to generate preferable patterns of outcomes than the selectivity of discretionary choice. So I, for my part, I regularly stop at red, accepting, because I'm trusting this selectivity more than my own selectivity if I would try to do always what is best given the situation. Now, what is an example in politics? Now, a traditional conflict between, or at least disagreement between German conceptions of economic policy and France's conception is about industrial policy. Industrial policy is about government specifically favoring particular industries because of the expectation they will be champions, so give them a head start, they will be get an advantage in international competition. Now here again, if governments were perfect in identifying, say simply now, future winners, then as a democratic society may wish to say, okay, yeah, let's government have this authority. But if we accept that governments are not perfect in identifying and adding the complication that results if government is authorized to grant special support to special industries or special branches, that then there will be a lobbying of all kinds of interest groups to be selected as such a future champion. And in this turmoil, you can be doubtful whether government will reliably pick what actually then eventually may turn out to be future winners, and instead waste money on projects that turn out as pure flops. So the knowledge problem is a reason why democratic citizen constituencies may rather want their government to be restrained to a rule-based policy rather than discretion. Now the second problem, the incentive problem. Discretionary case-by-case choice, as I mentioned or indicated earlier with my example, when to get up in the morning. Every morning you may be telling, let's stay a little bit longer. Or you have an unpleasant task. You have to write a paper for a seminar. And today was just a pleasant day. The sun is shining, so let's wait. Tomorrow is another day. So in case of discretionary choice, there's a temptation to give unproportional weight to short-term interests, or say unpleasant visit with the dentist. I have tooth pain, but it's not so bad yet. So let's wait, get the drilling a little bit later. There is a psychologist, Bernstein, who has developed a theory of what he calls hyperbolic discounting. So of course it makes sense to discount the future, but there is a difference between, say, a prudent discounting and what he calls a hyperbolic, to give disproportional weight. And basically what so figuratively, you could illustrate it by your vision. So if I put this up here and look at the wall, it covers disproportional size on the wall. This is hyperbolic discounting. So if you ask people, for instance, you can get 100 euros today or 105 euros in 2 months. Many people will take the 100 euros today, even though, given the current exchange rate, is irrational to do so. So that is and psychologists tell us this is an inherent weakness in our human nature to give disproportional weight to close by rather than to distant incentives. And rules can be or are typically an instrument of compensating or fighting this weakness. So for instance, to have the rule, apart from the seminars or lectures I have to attend, these hours of the day are devoted to work. And whether the sun shines or not, this is when I will work on the papers I have to do. So rules as an instrument of compensating this weakness. Now again, applied to politics, re-election politicians, re-election or election-seeking and re-election-seeking politicians are easily tempted to grant privileged treatment to particular interest groups to get their political support that they currently need, even if they know that the that the long-time damage to the economy is overcompensating is much more important, but they can even rationalize it to themselves by saying, okay, if I do something now which will endanger my re-election, then others will come in that will do even worse than I. So better I accept now something, even if I know it's not what is really conducive for the economy, but at least it keeps me in office so that I can prevent greater harm by staying in office. So whether it's on their part a benevolent attitude or not, still the problem remains that if they have the discretionary authority to grant for discretionary intervention, to grant privilege treatment, their immediate interest in getting elected or re-elected, their short-term interest, will be a risk that citizens of a democratic polity should take into account and then opt for, rather binding them to a policy, to a rule-based policy. Finally, the reputation problem. Again, our personal life, take question of telling the truth always, or being always honest, never cheating. Now, apparently, somebody who operates on the principle, I never lie, such a person will miss out on opportunities to realize gains that somebody who is not so bound may well realize. Or somebody says, in my dealings with others, I will always be honest. Such a person will miss out necessarily on opportunities to realize gains that somebody who is not so principled may realize. Now, there is a Canadian philosopher, David Gautier, who has developed a theory, basically in his book with the title Morals by Agreement. He says, okay, now on the short, say on first sight, this looks like that somebody who is unprincipled will do better in life, or may do better in life. He says, on second thought, this is not so. Why is this not so? A person who gets a reputation for always telling the truth, for always to be honest, such a person will necessarily be a more attractive partner in cooperation with others than a person who does not have such a reputation. And the more sustainable gains in social life are the gains that we can realize in cooperation with others. A cheater may benefit on certain occasions, but an honest person will be a more sought after partner in cooperative engagements, and such a person will overall then be able to realize larger benefits. Now, again applied to politics, and here instead of explaining it in my own words, I refer to three authors, or two co-authors and two single authors. One is the economists Keitman and Prescott. They published a very important and very influential paper under the title Rules Rather Than Discretion, applied to issues of economic policy. And their argument is as follows: a discretionary policy which seeks to select the decision which is best given the current situation, or I should go back a step. So the benefit that a rule follower, somebody who is a rule always to be honest, always to tell the truth, the benefits such rule follower may reap result from how others respond to the rule follower's behavior. It's how others adapt to it. Others will try to avoid somebody who is not principled, whom they must expect to cheat if there is an opportunity. So the one's fellow human beings respond to differently to whether one has a reputation of being an honest person or not. Now, and the same principle applies to politics. Again here, a discretionary policy which seeks to select the decision which is best given the current situation will fail because economic players will adjust their expectations. A policy of aggregate demand management, basically a Keynesian politics, for instance, is likely to result in excessive levels of inflation without lowering unemployment. And they conclude, policymakers should follow rules rather than discretion, and economic theory should be used to evaluate alternative policy rules, which is basically a plea for the Freiburg notion of Ordnungspolitik and the constitutional economics, even though they don't refer to it. It's not known to them. An earlier witness to this was the Chicago economist Henry Simons, who in fact knew about the Freiburg School and was in contact with the Freiburg scholars. He published in 1930 an article on rules versus authority in monetary policy. And he argued there, we must avoid a situation where every business decision becomes largely a speculation on the future of monetary policy. That is, business people adjusting their behavior to what they perceive government policy is, either discretionary or rule-based. Political control must degenerate into endless concessions to organized minorities with gradual undermining of the constitutional structure under which a free enterprise economy and representative government can function. In a most recent example, John Taylor, the economist who has become known for the Taylor rule for monetary policy, in an article published this year with the title Toward a Rules-Based International Monetary System, he argues, the international economy would be more stable if policymakers could create a more rules-based international monetary system. And finally, my conclusion. I cited at the beginning the economist with his asking, why are Germans so obsessed by rules for their own sake? Now, advocating rules-based politics must not at all be a sign of an obsession with rules for their own sake. As I tried to show, there are rational reasons for adopting and calling for a rule-based politics. There are rational reasons why the citizens of democratic policies may wish their governments to be bound to rule-based politics rather than having wide discretionary authority. And this is the end of my talk. Thank you for your attention.
We have about 1 hour left for questions. But maybe we will start with the 4 questions that I sent to you by mail. So the first question is, what is the moral basis of the market? If you have to summarize your conclusions on that point.
Now, taking the game metaphor, living together in society with regard to the economic system, our first question that we would have to decide, what kind of game do we want to play? Do we want to adopt a market economy or some alternate economic system? And this, what is legitimized in the end can only be legitimized by the voice of the people who are to live under this order. So if we would unanimously opt for adopting a planned economy, say people who join a monastery, they basically among themselves opt for a planned economy, and respecting individuals as ultimate sovereigns in how they wish to live, liberals would have to respect this. So we would have to respect if people would choose to live under a planned economy. Now, giving the working properties of the one and the other what they produce in the end, there are obvious rational grounds to opt for a market economy. And so one can defend the choice of a market economy in terms of the attractiveness, the desirability of the outcome patterns that it can be expected to produce. Now, adopting a market economy means, or has significant consequences for the two capacities in which each of us participates in the market economy. Vanberg, the law co-founder of the Vanberg School of Economics, has put Adam Smith's arguments that I mentioned earlier. Adam Smith, we produce in order to consume, therefore the economic system should be organized so that it works to the benefit of the consumer and not to the benefit of the producer. Vanberg, who was very imaginative in finding nice formulations, he said the market economy is an economic system where the consumer is sitting at the manual of the economic organs, so the consumer. So the rules should be such that the wishes of the consumers dominate the interests of the producers. Now, in a market economy, we are all, however, engaged on both sides. As, say, even if you may not know it, your parents may have left you a portfolio of stocks. As an owner of stocks, you are on the producer side. If you own stocks, say, for a steel company, given this interest, you would be in interest of protection or subsidies for the steel industry. So in our producer interest, we are opposed. And this is an internal conflict if you are an employee in a particular company or if you own a company. So you are on the producer side. And the market system is a system, basically, I like to say, where all participants enter into a social contract. We promise each other to accept the unpleasantness of competition, the pressure of competition, in order to be able to jointly benefit from the benefits that are created for consumers. So in this sense, this, I would say, is the moral basis. So the legitimacy of a market system in the end can only come from the people living under it, accepting it. Accepting it then means that we are obliged to accept the unpleasantness of competition, and that it is unethical if one lobbies government for special privileges with one producer interest. So the ethical basis is this, what I would call this social compact, that we agree in order to benefit as consumers, we accept the pressures and the unpleasantness of competition. And it's like in soccer, if you would bribe the referee in order to ignore when you are playing foul, or you lobby the FIFA to adopt a particular rule which you think is particularly favorable for you, is counter to the ethics of a market economy. That would be my response to the first question.
Can I summarize that the market should serve the consumer, and for that reason you have to have a market and competition, and you cannot deviate from the fundamental rules of a market without losing the advantage of realizing a human dignity that comes with a market that serves the interest of the people and not of specific interest groups.
Yes, basically by choosing to adopt a market economy, we implicitly make this contract, we implicitly promise each other, we accept the pressures on that we will be exposed to as producers in order to benefit as consumers. And this is a violation of the rules which we basically subscribe to by adopting a market economy. Now, the awareness of this is, of course, has been totally lost in our public discourse. But as far as my teaching is concerned, I try people to always remind of this, but in the general public, the awareness of this is, of course, very minimal. But I think this is the ultimate ethical basis of a market economy.
Okay. And then, if you adopt an economic constitution, what should be in that constitution? So, at the level of a constitutional lawmaker and not at the level of a legislator, which kind of principles, rules, and individual rights and institutions should be in that constitution? So individual rights, institutions, and principles.
Now, James Buchanan, by whose work I'm obviously very much influenced, he considered himself to be, of course, within the classical liberal tradition. But he has made an argument which I think is very important, especially for our understanding of the relation between the principles of liberalism and the principle of democracy. Buchanan makes a distinction between the premise of individual liberty and the premise of individual sovereignty. What does he mean by this? He says the traditional emphasis of liberalism is on the importance in the sense of individual autonomy, of private autonomy. The ability to individually choose by oneself without being constrained or accepted to everybody. But what individual liberty in this sense means is, of course, then specified by the rules. Specified what individual liberty in Belgium means is specified by Belgian private law and by public regulations. Whether you can, say, raise pigs in your backyard depends, for instance, on whether your backyard is in the middle of Leuven or outside of the countryside. So what individual liberty means depends on the rules of the game, private laws code and public regulations. So this raises the question of how do we judge these rules? And Buchanan's argument is, as a classical liberal, the more basic normative premise must be the premise of individual sovereignty, that we respect individuals' freedom to choose jointly with others under what kind of institutional organizational regime they wish to live. So that means that respecting individual sovereignty is, so to speak, a matter of principle. Which rules people adopt is a matter of prudence. So as liberals, as classical liberals, when we say are in exchange with our fellow citizens, our arguments for the kind of rule order that liberals favor, namely one that gives large scope to individual liberty, these arguments have to be in terms of prudential reasons. We have to convince our fellow citizens that this is an order that promises to work out in a manner that is more attractive to them. But ultimately, we have to respect their individual sovereignty. If in the end they say, no, we prefer these and these rules, we have to respect them, even if we consider this to be an unprudent choice. But we can only counter it on prudential reasons. Now, this implies now for your question that we cannot ex ante define what must be in the Constitution. Respecting individual sovereignty means that we have to respect whatever people agree on, what they want to adopt for the social regime under which they live. So about the content, we can only argue in terms of prudential reasons, making arguments for the benefit of a market system of individual liberty in various areas of social life and so on. But there cannot be an ex ante catalog that we can prescribe to our fellow citizen and say, okay, this has to be and you cannot question it. Now they can question everything. Our basic agreement has to be on the principle of individual sovereignty. People who don't accept this basic principle, like communists, with them it's not difficult to engage in a constructive dialogue about how we should organize our social life. Only with people who share this basic commitment that we have to respect each other as ultimate sovereigns among them, then they can prudentially exchange arguments about now what rules then should we specifically adopt. People who take the ultimate measuring rod for what is legitimate and suitable in social life from outer space, say they are insight into the laws of history, economists, or what Allah wants us to do, and as a privileged class can interpret. With those people you cannot engage in this kind of prudential discourse on what rules we should adopt. This is only possible among people who share this basic respect for each other as equally sovereign individuals.
Can you maybe give an example of a prudent constitutional rule that you would support or defend to pressure you a little bit on this point?
Yeah, for instance, this whole point of rule-based
so non-discrimination rule.
Non-discrimination, this would be
and equality before the law.
Yeah, but the non-discrimination seems almost to follow automatically from the premise of individual sovereignty, because those who will be discriminated would be asked to agree on a rule that is biased against them. You shouldn't expect agreement on such rules. If people are aware of it. The problem, of course, in much of the discriminating politics today is such that the beneficiaries are typically very small, concentrated group who are aware of being specially treated, while the costs are spread out across a large number of people. So who cares about the subsidies for the sugar industry? For the ordinary consumers, it makes a difference, say, of maybe 5 cents per month. Who would go on the street to demonstrate against sugar subsidies? But as a politician try to take away the sugar subsidies, then there will be a lot of people with their tractors on the roads and blocking streets and so on. So the awareness of being discriminated is not fully developed in many, many areas where actually discrimination takes place. And this makes it politically viable because the incentives are biased.
And should we create some of those rules on a European level, or can we do them all just in our nation state?
Now, in an ideal world, I would say, we would have a hierarchy of rules and rule setting and enforcing agencies dependent on, say, the geographical correspondence between the problem that is supposed to be solved and the jurisdiction, the extension of the institution that legislates and enforces the rules. So there are what in Europe is often appealed to as the principle of subsidiarity, but is rarely practiced as a viable principle. That would mean that you solve problems there where the beneficiaries, the rule setters, and those who have to pay for it, well, these groups coincide, where you have a mix-up, where the legislation is done on a level which is not the cost bearer, say in example, in many cities, in Freiburg, we have many tram lines through which are, say, very luxuriously laid out and so on. And this is true, and there are other examples. This is true to the fact that there's a mixed financing. The decision to build the tramlines in the way they are built is made by the local community. The financing is, say, 1/3 by the local community, 2/3 by the state of Baden-Württemberg. So where you don't have this coincidence, you get all kinds of problems. So the ideal world would be where you have actually a substantial implementation of the principle of subsidiarity. And in Germany, unfortunately, there's a new initiative now, and I'm afraid it will pass, to change the Grundgesetz again, which is the Grundgesetz, in order to allow the federal government to have a say, to co-finance, and then accordingly to have a say in the school system and university system. It's always the temptation of lower level units to benefit from finances granted from above. Now these finances, they are typically attached to the right to co-determine on how they are, and this erodes principles of federalism and the principle of subsidiarity. So in short, your answer, substantiation of the principle of subsidiarity would be my ideal.
So we went through the 4 prepared questions, so now the floor is yours. You can ask whatever you want, but please try to relate it to the topic of the seminar. Who goes first? Maybe one of the researchers, because you have to leave after 15 minutes, and then the rest, the honor program students, still have another hour to speak with the speaker.
So according to the private school, governments have to adhere to rules rather than impact the market directly. But those rules have to be enforced somewhere, and those enforcement actions are, well, they impact the market. And in enforcement, governments or agencies have some degree of discretion. Usually they can set priorities, for example. And how does this private school solve this problem? Because here also rent seeking could be beneficial to companies or to interest groups.
Now, basically, the legislation, the setting of the rules, and the enforcement would be separate, because the enforcement would be the task of the judicial system. But you are right if the motivation of your question is that there may be some influence from politics to the judicial system with regard to how strictly to enforce rules. And there is, in fact, some empirical evidence. My successor as director of the Walter Eucken Institute, Professor Lars Feld, who is a member of the German Council of Economic Advisors. He is also an expert in, or is an expert in taxation system, and he has compared how certain tax rules are enforced in the sense of because they have the taxation authorities, they have to prove the documents that firms provide, that certain rules, which are essentially the same across all the Bundesländer, the German states, are enforced with differential degrees of strictness. And that this then may again be, say, an incentive for companies to locate in a state, in a Bundesland, where the enforcement is less strict. But I would say that this potential of discriminatory treatment seems to me rather limited, as opposed to granting government directly the authority to legislate differential rules for different players in the economic game. But I would not deny that this was totally absent from the area that you are referring to.
Do we have a follow-up question or?
I would like to ask a question on enforcement also. I've been thinking a bit about the automatic execution of contracts in the context of, for instance, smart contracts on a blockchain or a distributed ledger, or also the fact that you could, for instance, implement a prohibition on parking in a certain spot by marking the spot with a bar, so that you just can't park your car there. So that basically the automatic enforcement of rules. And I would like to hear your view on whether the automatic enforcement of rules in principle is a good idea, because in my view, the impossibility of considering all things, as Hayek referred to, plays an important role when you agree with your counterparty or with your constituents that rules will be automatically enforced. Because when the time comes that the rules are enforced, the situation can be different. And that is why we have currently in our law principles such as the principle of good faith and other sort of wishy-washy principles a bit. But those are principles that the judge can apply in order to mitigate the potentially damaging consequences of automatic enforcement. So I would like to hear your views on whether we should go one way or the other.
No, in fact, it relates to your previous question, because your question understood as discretionary scope for the government. Now you are referring to the problem of discretionary scope on the part of the enforcer. Now, as we know, in many parts of this world, corruption is an extreme problem, and this corruption occurs to a large extent at the enforcement level. And I was told, if you ever visit Mexico, you better don't rent a car and drive the car on your own. You are likely to be stopped by a policeman, and you have to pay a certain amount in order to be able to allowed to go on, even if you have complied with all the rules. So this is a huge problem of enforcement by human beings if you don't have a framework, again, that disciplines those. Now, automatic enforcement would eliminate this problem altogether. Now, you point out that a disadvantage of such automatic enforcement would be that you would not be able to take into account special circumstances that, if you know them, would motivate you to not say simply to impose the sanction as an automatic enforcer would do so. This is certainly true. But on the other hand, I think one has to consider what is the basic function of enforcement. The basic function of enforcement, you can look at enforcement in two ways. Enforcement as a response to past behavior, and enforcement as a signal to the general public with regard to their future behavior. Now, the ability to take into account the particular circumstances of the situation allows you to say to do more justice to the past, but it limits or takes away from the signaling capacity to the future. So whatever you emphasize, I'm reminded of a formula that David Hume stated, said all rules have disadvantages. There will always be situations where you would rather not apply the rules. But once you start to decide on each particular instance whether or not to apply the rule, you are no longer benefiting from the signaling task of rules, namely to give a general signal to everybody to orient his or her future behavior, taking into account that if you violate this rule, then sanctions will follow. So to the extent, the more you take into account past circumstances, say the more the judge shows an understanding for the particular difficulties a person was in, and the more the judge adjusts the penalty according to these circumstances, the less strict will be the signaling effect, because people will take into account that there may be this possibility of, say, getting a reduced sense. I didn't formulate it as nice as I would have liked to, but this is the basic. So Hume has an example, of course. If a person steals bread, then you would think, okay, this person is hungry and so we should not. But say modifying the applicability of the rule with regard to such circumstances necessarily takes away from the basic function that rules are supposed to fulfill in coordinating our actions. But there are arguments for both sides, and so you have to weigh them, and maybe the solution is to limit the scope to which, say, specific considerations can modify the sanction that is in general applicable.
I don't want to lose my position, but first of all, thank you for your very exciting talk. But I think this is a really very exciting discussion about automatic sanctions. I'm wondering to what extent actually the imperfection of life currently makes reconciling both like doing more justice and increasing the signaling function of rules possible, to the extent that, for instance, lower courts that grant the possibility of doing justice to particular circumstances, like let's say justices of the peace who will grant like an extension of payment, for instance, to a bad debtor, that this is possible because the judgments are not being published. But what will happen as soon as the whole justice system becomes transparent? So then, of course, the signaling function is the only one that predominates, and the judge cannot do justice to particular circumstances anymore, because otherwise he knows that always there will be damage to the signaling function of the rule. So I think it's really a very a topic of great interest nowadays, since there is also this call for transparency in everything. And then, of course, the signaling function starts to predominate, and doing justice in particular circumstances becomes very, very difficult. And it reminds me actually of discussions which you have, well, still today, but especially already in the Middle Ages and the early modern period, about the legitimacy of like excommunication, latae sententiae. So it still exists in the church today. Like if the doctor does euthanasia, for instance, or abortion, he's automatically excommunicated. So there will not be a judge who will pronounce the sentence and who will first be able to consider the particular circumstances of the action, because it's an excommunication latae sententiae, like an automatically enforced sanction because the criminal act is happening. So I think it's very exciting, this kind of debate. And I wonder if the position of an ordo liberal can change, like taking into account this increasing transparency of judgments, of decisions.
No, I think there's really nothing to add to the conflict that you point out, and I don't think that there is a general answer to how to deal with this problem. There are two values. Transparency is a value, but on the other hand, if you want to compromise between the general signaling function and at the same time possibility of taking account of particular circumstances without damaging the signaling function, then to be less transparent may be the way to go, except that this again may bear the risk that if it becomes known that in intransparent ways particular circumstances are accommodated, then this damages the signaling function too. As far as the Catholic Church is concerned, in her wisdom, she allows for an exposed correction. You go to the priest and confess.
Focused on prof privileges to the weaker party, to the party unequal bargaining power, such as the employee, such as the renter, such as generally the consumer. How do you feel about that?
In general, I have strong reservations against this general privileging the supposedly weaker party, because it can very well depend on particular circumstances who is the weaker party. So to classify particular groups ex ante as the weaker party, I think in general in the market economy, consumers are in a very strong position. Producers have to compete for the favor of consumers. So if one by weakness means, for instance, an informational discrepancy between the producer knows much more about his or her product than the consumer, then I think proper way to do so would be transparency requirements and publication requirements, rather than to simply give a favorite stance in cases of judicial disputes. That would be, but at the same time, I must admit this is a problem I have not as carefully thought about as I have about other problems. So my answer here is more a provisional one. Maybe after more careful deliberation, I could say more more relevant things on this issue.
I don't know if this falls under the same category, but I was troubled with if you say that one of the basic principles is there is equal sovereignty, but this is I think it's very difficult within light of economic dependency that you have in this open market, and how does order liberal concept deal with power relationships that exist and that make, or that you need not to privilege anyone, but to protect certain groups or to protect certain actors? How do you create there with the principle?
Now the principal answer of the Freiburg School is can be given in terms of what Franz Böhm, as I said earlier, he has always these nice formulations. He says competition is the most effective instrument for dispersal of power that humankind has invented or found in its history. So the Freiburg, the principal recipe would be create competition, and competition is a depowering or power reducing instrument. The Freiburg school advocates would certainly, and this relates, as you pointed out, to the previous question, they would be very hesitant to adopt other instruments like giving a privileged legal statute to particular groups. Rather, they would say create sure competition. that relates to another issue. The Freiburg school people, they were critical about discretionary governmental power, but they were equally critical of economic power. And they were in particular critical about, say, an economic constitution which privileges large enterprises. And such privileging they would have seen, or they saw, for instance, in the reduction of liability requirements for corporations. So for them, the possibility to earn profits and to be liable for one's action had to be closely connected in a market economy. And so many things that result from the legal framework and from government regulation that contain a bias in favor of largeness, they were really critical of. Say, for instance, in Germany, and probably it will be similar in many other countries, government has simply delegated many of the tasks that it would have to perform, say in order, for instance, to collect the revenue from which it finances its activities to companies. So the collection of taxes, collection of contributions to the healthcare system, information requirements, and all kinds of things. These are typically tasks that the government has delegated to private businesses, which impose a disproportionate burden on smaller and medium-sized companies, because economies of scale make this much better bearable for large corporations. So they would have argued all these things contribute to a bias in favor of largeness, which reduces again competition. So they would have called for having an eye on all these aspects in order to make sure that the system actually operates in an unbiased way and with an effective unbiased competition.
Maybe we can relate it to their views on competition law, because I think that's strongly correlated with the subject.
Oh yeah, competition law was the major area on which the Freiburg school concentrated. Also Franz Böhm was a competition lawyer in his school, his student Mestmaker, and then next generation Böhm. Their field is always competition law. So that was their main focus, how to create and maintain a truly competitive system and monitor actually the operation of how the economic system actually operates. If you identify any kinds of problems, like for instance the power of large corporations, you should go back to the rule level and think about what could be changed in the rules of the system. Of course, there is in general, they were in favor of smaller size structure of smaller size companies to dominate the market. The problem is that at the same time they had this criterion of, as I mentioned earlier, Leistungswettbewerb. So companies should compete for the favor of consumers, and the only way for them to succeed should be better service to consumers. Now there can be a conflict. That position to serve consumer interests. Do you prohibit them from growing at the expense of better service to consumers? So it's actually, there are many things which look easy in principle. If you have actually to apply them, it becomes more complicated. Say simply, in order to maintain economic structure with smaller and medium-sized company, to impose a general limit on the growth of a company may hamper the economy's capacity to serve consumer interests. So that would not be the recipe. So even the awareness of the general problem does not immediately show you how to remedy it. But this is, of course, then what keeps a research program alive, that you have continuously to think about new problems and to deliberate about alternative solutions to this. If we could, once and for all, have a recipe book to solve all these problems, then you could close the books, you could close the department that's dealing with these issues. But that's not how the world works. We have, as Hayek has nicely put it, this is the economy is a journey of exploration into the unknown. So we are going ahead and constantly new things, and then we have to adapt our rule framework to these new problems. Now, in your earlier question, you mentioned blockchain. This is a miracle to me, or not a riddle to me. I don't understand. So to this aspect, I could not have responded at all. I have a vague idea what this is about, but this is an issue that will be an important issue for competition policy, for regulation, and so on. And we now see that countries are trying to get a head start in providing a framework for these kind of economic activities to get a head start in this what seems to be a future growing market. So it's always new challenges.
I have a question concerning environmental interests and the pressure the state has to resist from interest groups. If the rules are good, as in are morally acceptable, I understand the Virginia school, but what about rules that need to change because there is this moral pressure on states that we come to a new understanding that for the general interest, also environmental problems need to be dealt with. So how does this strong state that resists pressure is itself pressured in a way to change rules that are not good?
No, in a market economy and in the liberal society in general, there is a strict division of labor. The players in the game, their responsibility is to play fairly, to respect the given rules as they are. The responsibility for developing a framework of rules that is suitable to solve the problems that we face is the joint responsibility, is the possibility of the citizenry and the delegation to parliaments and government. So environmental issues, they cannot be expected to be so internally solved by the market mechanism. External costs will not be taken into account by the decision maker. A firm that produces something and emits smoke, the damage caused by the smoke will not be taken into the company's balance sheet, except there's a rule prohibiting it from doing so. But this rule will not automatically endogenously created within the markets. It has to be created by the legislator. And this is true for all kinds of environmental problems. That is, the responsibility for creating a rule framework which makes for a, say, sustainable economic development is a responsibility of the legislator. Now, the legislator typically gets active if there is some kind of pressure coming from somewhere. And this pressure comes, say, from lobbying groups that are dedicated to environmental issues. Which, again, does not mean that any demand that Greenpeace voices should immediately become law. The task of the legislative process is to deliberate. If we adopt this rule, what will be the overall consequences? And in light of the consequences, do we want to adopt it or do we not want to adopt it? Rules that look nice on the face and morally good may, upon closer examination, lead to consequences that we consider so undesirable that we rather don't want to adopt and come to the conclusion the problem that we want to solve, we must approach in a different way. So we have to distinguish between the role of, say, public pressure groups lobbying for environmental regulation and the process through which we should decide what type of regulation to adopt.
So if I understand correctly, this pressure that different groups exercise on the state and the resistance of the state doesn't mean that it doesn't listen to the pressure groups, but just that it remains the state's choice whether or not.
And the responsibility of the legislator to adopt rules which then work out in a way which is actually desirable for the citizenry overall, and not just to give in to pressure to gain votes. The temptation is, of course, there, just as the temptation to give in to, because if you think, oh, this is a popular demand, so just let's let it, we have enough of this supposedly popular demand, and get legislation to increase the retirement. Look at Italy. They are giving in to supposedly popular demands, but the consequences are predictably disastrous. And this is an irresponsible government, not a responsible government. And the task of government, the legislator, is to act responsibly, on behalf of our interests, to carefully deliberate what will be the consequences if we adopt this rule, and this will be the consequences overall, be beneficial or not. It's easy for particular groups to advocate something because they don't carry the responsibility of what will actually follow. It's a responsibility of the legislator, and that again leads to a question of whether the democratic institutional structure we have is care of this problem, that the legislature is sufficiently motivated in its decision to take into account the longer-term consequences of its actions. Hayek, whom I mentioned earlier, he has made an argument which I find very convincing. He says a basic defect of our current democratic institutional structure is that the same representative assembly, the parliament, is in charge of monitoring day-to-day politics and supporting the current government, and is in charge of defining the rules under which the system, the private law system and the political system should operate. And this is the same assembly. This assembly is in temptation, constant temptation, with regard to current needs of government to define the rules, rather than thinking about long-term consequences, so that the current Italian parliament is in temptation to grant a basic income irrespective of the long-term consequences, to reduce the retirement age because of the short-term need to support the current government. And Hayek's proposal is we should separate these two functions strictly into two separate representative assembly, one being in charge of controlling and supporting, carrying the current actions of government, and the other one being in charge of defining the rules. The representatives should be elected in different ways, so to separate the two starts so that the chamber which is in charge of defining the rules should be, as well as this can be accomplished, be isolated from temptation to give in to current governmental needs. I found this very convincing, but the prospects for getting this implemented in our democratic system are, of course, not so large.
And how do you prevent party politics to collude between the two chambers?
Yeah, that would be, Hayek had a proposal which has drawn a lot of criticism, which I don't find so very convincing. either the chamber in charge, or the representative assembly in charge for defining the rules, he thought should be elected, or the representatives should be elected from age cohorts. Supposedly that the members of the cohort know each other better and can have a better judgment about. So I don't find this to be the. How to solve this problem would be a difficult task. That would be again a task for constitutional lawyers and constitutional economists to research.
What he proposed was very similar to what we do for a constitutional court. Every generation is able to appoint one additional judge, and then you end up with a mix of people who are independent for the rest of their life. It was not that new what he proposed, I guess. Other questions?
To me, the ordoliberal system sounds very convincing, and the reasons why we really need to stick to rules, the knowledge problem, incentive problem, are very convincing. So my question is it possible to, on the one hand, adhere to the ordoliberal system and the respect for rules, and on the other hand, still allow for that other basic principle that kind of runs through our Western legal system, that the highest justice can lead to the highest injustice, like the summa jus, summa inuria. Is there a way to reconcile like faithfulness to the ordoliberal tenets and still accept that sometimes there can really be very, very exceptional circumstances where we have to deviate temporarily from them? Or more specifically, for instance, in the case of the financial crisis, can it be allowed even for an ordoliberal to kind of intervene in a non-orthodox way?
Of course, there's this famous paraphrasing of fiat justitia et pereat mundi. And the counter phrase is fiat justitia ut non pereat mundus. But the problem you raise is, of course, an important problem. The difficulty is if you say introduce, say, a general clause saying, okay, this is the rule that should be adhered to, then addition, except there are extraordinary circumstances where it's advisable not to apply the rule. Then you grant discretionary authority to the institution or the authority or whoever who is in charge of defining, is this case now given or is not given? So such a blanket exception would not seem to be a very useful thing, because the danger is it can be easily misused. So another possibility would be to specify ex ante what such extraordinary circumstances would be, to limit the discretionary authority to define case by case if such circumstances are given. Which, of course, raises then the question again, if something comes up which is not listed in these previously defined extraordinary circumstances, what to do then? You may even add a clause, but then you may want to adopt, say, decision-making procedures which are restrictive and limit the discretionary scope. But so I think there are good reasons to prepare for cases which actually may come up, where we definitely do not want to apply a rule. But the possibility to identify instances as being such cases should be again limited in a rule-based way. If we allow for general discretion, then it's basically, say, giving a blank check to whoever is authorized to identify what is an extraordinary situations, to do so if he or she or the assembly considers it opportune to. And in the European case, we have, the wake of the Euro crisis, have seen many instances where such rule breaking has taken place, and it has not, in my view, worked to the benefit of the European Union. So the think it's always wise to stick to rule-based procedures. Unfortunately, in the euro case, it was the German government who opened the floodgates when Chancellor Schröder called for an exemption for Germany to be allowed to exceed the public debt limit, and frankly put the southern European states, they were only waiting for such a signal that now they can easily claim to have the same right to be granted exemption.
I have a question reverting back to what you quote of The Economist. It paints Germany as the ordoliberalism system in the world. In your experience and in your view, is it the most rule-based economy in the world, Germany? Would you qualify it that way? Because based on what Economist says, it seems to be. And I can imagine, in a certain way, knowing the position of Germany within the EU.
No, I would say at least in Germany's self-image, the role of Ordnungspolitik, of rule-based politics, is still considered, say, to be a German trademark. How far this is actually reflected in the policy practice, this is a different question. So Germany is certainly much less in its economic policy a rule-based, adheres to rule-based politics than the Freiburg school advocates would have wanted. And an example is our current economics minister, Altmaier, who in response to the recent report of the German Council of Economic Advisors, and the German Council of Economic Advisors typically is emphasizing the need for rule-based and Ordnungspolitik, and he brushed this report aside and said, oh, we cannot confine ourselves to Ordnungspolitik. So because he wants to create an industry or support by huge amounts of money an industry in Germany to produce batteries for electric automobiles and so on. So he has an idea of what kind of industry should be favored and supported. And this is, of course, in contradiction to Ordnungspolitik. So rarely has an economic minister so openly brushed aside the Ordnungspolitik tradition as he does. But still, in general, in the German public, it's still so the understanding that this is a kind of specialty of Germany, that, and in the general interpretation, the relative German economic success is attributed to this kind of policy orientation.
You spoke of the moral foundation of the market economy as if it would lie in a social contract. And I was wondering, does this not deny the reality that no one actually explicitly or implicitly enters into a social contract, but rather is born into it without having much of a say as to where he's born and what social contract?
No, that's a very legitimate question. So the Buchanan type constitutional economics is often also characterized with the attribute contractarian. And this is the basic notion of what legitimizes social arrangement, is the agreement among those who live under the arrangement. Now, Buchanan, in this regard, generalizes the liberal principle which favors markets, is based on the notion that markets are, arenas of economic interaction which is framed by rules which in particular aim at eliminating or excluding influencing others through fraud and coercion. So ideally, the market is supposed to work as an arena where only social transactions take place to which the participants voluntarily agree, which can, of course, never be perfectly realized. There is theft, there is fraud, there is deception, but the legislative process and the judicial process aims at creating such a framework. So the notion is within the market, voluntary agreement is the basic legitimizing principle. Then the question is what legitimizes, as I said earlier, the rules. And then the argument is consistency requires that we apply the same criterion here, voluntary agreement. Now, for all kinds of social arrangements that are concluded within the market, say the formation of organizations, of business corporations with many participants, can be said to be any kind of voluntary association. If you are a member of a tennis club, then by joining the club, or the soccer club if you play soccer, then by your decision to join the organization, you have effectively given your agreement to the Constitution. You cannot say, okay, I don't know of this. No, by becoming a member, you have effective, even if you didn't care to read the Constitution, but by your legal step to become a member. So with regard to all organizations existing within this framework that is supposed to assure that only things take place that are voluntarily agreed upon, we can assume this. This is different, obviously, by polities. Because, as you said, say, your tennis club has no members that have been born into it. But in our political communities, typically we have been born into it. So the question then is, does this mean that we have to adopt a different legitimizing principle? It is difficult to see what it should be. So if we adhere to the principle that whatever goes on within the polity is legitimized by the members of the polity's agreement to the constitutional rules, then we either find, say, a substitute interpretation that we have this construction of tacit agreement, that by still remaining within the polity, not leaving it, you give your tacit agreement. I personally would think it desirable to create a better awareness of the fact that as members of a democratic polity, we are subscribing to the Constitution, and that whatever goes on within the polity, there are many decisions that are made that run counter to our interests, that we disagree with. But we are required to accept them as long as they are made in correspondence to the general rules. And so the requirement to accept it can only be derived from our consent to the rules, to the Constitution. Because we have agreed to it, therefore we have to accept what in rule-following manner results internally. So in order to create this awareness, I think it would be useful, for instance, that at an age of, say, where we now get the right to vote, that you get an option to say, okay, I want to be a full member of this community, or I want a resident alien, want to be the status of a resident alien. So I don't subscribe to the Constitution, I dissent with it, I just want to have the right to continue to reside here. So to create this awareness that at one point in life we actually subscribe, declare our agreement with the existing Constitution. That would be, a cracket to compensate for what in effect is impossible, to have continuing polities as intergenerational associations to be always based on the explicit voluntary agreement of the participants. This is a problem that's in the nature of things, but still the only legitimizing principle of a democratic polity is that the members of the polity are in agreement on the constitution, on the basic rules according to which the internal operation of the political process takes place. I don't see any alternative, useful or convincing alternative to this kind of approach.
One of the proposals of Hayek, and I believe also Buchanan, was to create smaller governments so that you would have more options to choose from. So creating a marketing government structures that would be available within the distance of your workplace, for example.
Yeah. Now, as it's typically presented and interpreted, I have strong reservations for the following reason. Now, governments, democratic governments, operate in two functions. They are, on the one side, what I like to call jurisdictional or territorial. Government defines the rules under which anybody has to comply with who lives or operates within the territorial boundaries of the government's jurisdiction. On the other hand, they are what I like to call club enterprises. They are organizations with their members, the citizens' members, and they provide, or can at least provide, particular services for their members. Now, this idea that Hayek and Buchanan have emphasized with the notion of jurisdictional competition is basically emphasizing the right of individuals to freely migrate between different territories. Now, by locating within a particular territory, you choose the government as a territorial enterprise. Now, I lived for 12 years in the US. While living in the US, I was still a German citizen. I was a resident alien in the United States. I wasn't allowed to vote. I had to pay my taxes. At the same time, being a German citizen, I maintained certain rights. I could return any time to Germany in case I would have been unable to earn a living. I would have a claim to the German social assistance system. In case I get into difficulties in a foreign country, I had a claim to the assistance by the German embassy there, and so on and so on. So as a club member, I would have found it very adequate and systematically consistent if the German government would have asked me to pay my membership contribution. Maybe a reduced one because certain services I did not, but do so. Now, the point I'm trying to make, by emphasizing the territorial exit only, you neglect the club role of governments. And it was very significant. Hayek has published an article, I think in 1940 or 42, with the title Interstate Federalism. And there he envisioned a federalist Europe. And this federalist Europe should be organized such that the central government's task is to assure that the governments of the member states don't erect barriers between them, so to ensure the free movement of persons, capital, and labor, like the common market we have. And Hayek then said, under such an arrangement, the national governments would basically transform into corporations, which provide the local, the framework in their jurisdiction. Now, if that is so, then think of, okay, if that is so, then say the German government, the Belgian government could just be carried out, say, by McDonald's or MasterCard. So they would be in competition, would be responsive to the locational decisions. It takes out the role of governments as the club enterprises, where there are members, the citizens' members, who want to co-determine what goes on. And that would be a theme for a whole separate presentation, but to briefly indicate, in Europe, we have, in the European Union, we have now many problems arising in in the member states, feeding populist movements, which in my view have to do with the fact that this distinction between governments' roles, national governments' roles as territorial enterprises and as club enterprises is ignored. Say the common market principle, of course, implies that governments cannot discriminate, are not allowed to discriminate between their own nationals and citizens from other European member states in their capacity as market participants. So create a common market means that the way governments, national governments treat market participants, they cannot discriminate. This has been interpreted by rulings of the European Court and by directives of the European Commission in ways that disallow governments to discriminate between their own citizens and citizens of other European member states in their capacities as club enterprises. So the whole question of what claims do European citizens, say a Romanian who migrates into Germany, what claims do such citizens from other member states have with regard to the social assistance system of the national government? Is Austria allowed to give preferred admission to its publicly funded universities to its own citizens, for instance, to the medical education, or not? So this is, in my view, ignoring this essential difference between the two functions of governments. But as I said, this is opening up a new topic that one could talk a lot about.